main focus of the class will be kind of this mock interview session we'll be doing. So I'm going to go over a little bit of content, but the bulk of the class will be doing these mock interviews, which hopefully should be pretty representative of what it's actually like to do a phone screen. And yeah, so let's get started. Let me share my screen really quickly and pull that up. Awesome. All right, so for the first portion of the class, I'll kind of just be going over some basically tips on how to identify like which data structures to use, just a quick overview of the data structures, and then I'll kind of spend some time going over mock interview instructions. So talking about what you should do as an interviewer and as an interviewee, because this is something I think we'll be repeatedly doing every week. So it's something that we should try to get right and trying to ensure that everyone has like a very good experience. So we'll do that, and then we'll break out into the mock interview sessions. And during those mock interview sessions, we'll have TAs, like we have quite a few TAs actually this time. So they'll be kind of jumping in and out and trying to help out. So once that's over, we'll just kind of recap everything, and that's just a general overview of what we'll be doing today. All right, so I guess before I go on, are there any questions that people had from last session? A lot of people stayed behind and asked questions, which is great. So if you do have any questions, you can also feel free to ask them at the end of the class. I'm always here for around like 10 minutes or so, trying to just make sure that everyone's questions are addressed. Okay, awesome. In that case, I'll try to be looking at the Zoom group chat. Sometimes I know last session it was quite noisy, so sometimes if I don't get around to answering your question, feel free to just to stay behind and I'll definitely answer it then. So just a few tips. I know like learning all these data structures and a lot of data structures you'll be later on, it can be really overwhelming. So I think when you're thinking about what data structures to use, you should probably start off with a brute force answer if an answer isn't immediately clear. And then if you have that brute force answer, try to identify the bottleneck if you can. I know some people kind of were concerned with, hey, what if I have a brute force answer and I'm not sure what else to do next? I think the first thing you should do is kind of just try to figure out what that bottleneck is in your brute force solution. And things to consider are, is there anything that's happening that's repetitive? So example, if you're trying to check which elements of array A are in the other array B, then the brute force would be that you would, for each element in array A, you would go through all the elements in array B to see if it exists. But maybe you can consider like utilizing a set instead. So how can you utilize like extra data structures to improve on that situation? So the other thing to consider, aside from like time complexity that interviews will always ask you about, is also space complexity. So is the space you're using, like, is it being utilized too much? If so, like, are there data structures that can help? So aside from like the data structures you'll be learning this week, we'll be going into a few more. So like trees are actually really common as well, and we'll have a section dedicated on trees. We'll also be covering graphs as well. So you'll kind of be building up more tools that can help you speed up your solutions. So when you kind of have that brute force solution, or you have some kind of approach that you think might work, you should kind of reflect on the data structures you know and think about how it can reduce that bottleneck. Right. Sorry, 1 second. All right. So one example is that like hash tables can optimize frequent lookups. So if you kind of are stuck, maybe you can think of like, how can I utilize a hash table to optimize for specific steps of the current brute force solution? So a few other tips on what data structures to use. It honestly will take a bit of practice. Like what I found throughout my experience is that I think as I go through more problems, I just gain the intuition of like what data structure to use when I see a problem. A lot of the times I think like there are just a lot of approaches that will teach you throughout the class, and a lot of data structures that will expose you to, and hopefully that you're already familiar with. And throughout practice, you'll just get really comfortable like seeing a problem and being able to identify it. We do have a ton of practice problems. So aside from like the warm-ups we give you, and aside from like the in-class practice we give you, there's actually like session 2, more practice problems there. I think it's always a great idea for you to go through those if you feel like there's a certain area you're not comfortable with. And generally what I found is that as I practice more, I get more comfortable. I also get a lot faster at implementing it. So practice is definitely pretty important. So when you're reviewing a data structure, I think especially if you feel rusty about these data structures, you should think about how it compares to the other data structures you know. So you should be able to kind of quickly do that comparison in your head, and you should know all those trade-offs between the different data structures. So what does this data structure do well as opposed to other ones? Generally, there are trade-offs between the different data structures, and what does this data structure kind of do poorly at? So we'll kind of review and do this exercise with the data structures we know already. So the other thing I think is a good tip is when you're kind of reading through a solution, I know it's honestly quite unrealistic to be able to solve all the problems we give you. So what I found to be really helpful is sometimes I'll kind of give myself a time box. So if I'm dealing with a really, really hard problem, instead of maybe spending like more than an hour on it, sometimes maybe trying and spending like 45 minutes to an hour and seeing how far I get. And at that point, maybe it's helpful to kind of look at the solution because I'm not making substantial progress on my own. That's kind of a good strategy that I think has helped me get through a lot of questions when I've reviewed and practiced for interviews in the past. So what I do is I try a coding problem. I will kind of try to get as much as I can in the 45 minutes to an hour that I give myself. And if I can't, I'll kind of look at the solution. And when I'm reading through the solution, I'm trying to be very aware of like why they utilize the data structure for that problem. And then I'll kind of revisit it and try to redo it in around a few days or so. Oh, so someone asks, how about after an hour we couldn't solve the problem? So I think I've done both. Sometimes I'll just kind of let myself like think about the problem. I think sometimes what can happen is you're kind of stuck in a rut. Like you see a problem that's really hard and you're stuck there for an hour. And I'm not sure if it's much more productive to spend more than like 2 hours on it. I think at a certain point, it might be helpful to look at that solution and see why you kind of stumbled on that problem. So I like to look at the solution after I feel like I've given myself like a fair amount of time. But at the very least, when I am given a hard problem, I'll try to at least come up with a solution. And if it's not the most optimal, I like to reflect on the solutions that are there to see what they did right. And I'll actually go back and try to redo that question in around like a week. I found that that's really helpful because just, I think reading a solution is very different than actually implementing it yourself. So I'd recommend after also reading the solution to just kind of maybe like in a week or so or in a few days or so, actually go back and try to implement that solution because I think that really ensures that you fully understand that solution. Yeah. Cool. So in regards to mock interviewing, did anyone actually have any questions about like data structures in general? So like the rest of this week, there's like more practice problems with these data structures that you can go through in the session 2 tab. So sorry, let me open this up. Not the session 2 tab, it's the assignment tab right here. So if you want more practice with data structures, there's actually these 3 problems, which I actually think are pretty good problems to tackle and to try to solve on your own. So if you want these, like I'd highly recommend you go through them and practice them. Next week is also a review session. So next week, we kind of just want to expose you to more of these problems as well, just so that you're kind of on good footing before you move on to the next weeks. So always look out for this assignment tab and the practice problems here. We like to give you like as many problems as you feel like you'll need before you do that hacker rank. So someone asks, how often are data structures used in industry? So I think data structures, well, dictionaries are really common. So I use them in my day-to-day. Like that's a very common data structure we use. I know, well, I work at Pinterest, so there's a lot of pretty big like distributed problems. So we'll utilize like a graph to model like the relationship between like people and like boards and pins. So that's also a super commonly used data structure. Trees are super common as well. So I think in general, a lot of these data structures are pretty common to use. I think they kind of tend to be, they tend to look slightly different in that for really, really big companies that have like millions of users, they kind of are utilized in like a more distributed fashion. But yeah, they're super common. So especially I think trees are really common and like utilized in many different ways. So yeah, you can view like the DOM as a tree. Like there are different ways and like different real world like comparisons of technologies to like data structures you're being exposed to. Okay, cool. So we'll kind of, so in, based off of my personal experience with phone screens, I just kind of want to give you guys a overview of what it looks like at Pinterest. So at Pinterest, generally, people will kind of go through a coding challenge, and if they go through a coding challenge, they'll go to a phone screen. And with a phone screen, what that kind of looks like is you're given like an hour. So you're slotted an hour to kind of solve a question. So what that'll look like is within that first hour, well, there's only 1 hour, sorry. So within that hour, the first around like 5 minutes or so, they'll kind of chat, they'll kind of introduce themselves, ask you to introduce yourselves, and then generally you'll jump into a coding question, which means like you kind of have around like 45 to 50 minutes to code up a question. So when you're doing a phone screen, what generally happens is it's actually very similar to that format that we were using in the last session, where you will basically both be on this kind of like collaborative, I think they use CoderPad is really common. So you'll both be kind of sharing that screen, your interviewer will tell you the question, and then you're kind of expected to code up a solution. So a lot of times they'll kind of expect you to run code, they'll kind of expect you to go through a few examples, and they'll expect that at the end, yeah, at the very end of it, you'll have some kind of working solution, and ideally you can go through a few test cases. So Michelle asks in that Zoom group chat, are phone screen questions generally leak code medium level questions? I'd say yes. I think the difficulty generally falls in that leak code medium level difficulty. I know, at least from my experience, some people will kind of have their questions be multiple parts. So they'll kind of try to break like a leak code medium level question into multiple parts and just kind of guide you through the way. So I think there are some companies that are a little more aggressive and might expect you to more quickly go through problems. So there are certain companies that might expect you to go through 2 leak code medium level questions within that span of like 45 minutes to an hour. So it kind of depends on the company as well. But generally, from what I've seen, it's leak code medium level difficulty questions. Sometimes you might get that occasional leak code hard level questions. So it's just good, I think, to have exposure to those problems and kind of be able to actually make progress in leak code hard questions as well. Sometimes you're just kind of seeing like, if it is a hard question, I think they'll generally recognize that it's hard and they kind of want to see how much progress you can make as well. So I'd say don't neglect practicing hard questions because it can pop up now and then. But yeah. So cool. So that's kind of what a phone screen looks like. In person, the interviews themselves are actually a bit shorter. They tend to fall in that like 45-minute time span. So within 45 minutes, it's a similar structure. Well, you'll probably spend like 5 minutes or so introducing yourself. For each interviewer, you'll kind of have to do this introduction multiple times. So you'll introduce yourself to the interviewer, the interviewer will introduce themselves to you, and then you'll spend the rest like 40 minutes or so trying to tackle that question. Yeah, so I'll kind of answer a few questions before we jump into instructions. So if someone asks, if you have come across the question before, should you tell the interviewer? Yeah, so I've actually been in, so what happens is after like these interviews happen, all the interviewers at Pinterest will kind of get in a panel and we'll discuss. I think there are not many times, there's been like a few cases where we felt like an interviewer knew the question and just didn't tell us. And so it's probably better to let your interviewer know, definitely let them know that you've seen this question before. And sometimes they might just ask you to solve it anyway, but it's good to be honest because we can tell on the interviewer side of things when someone has seen our question, given that we ask it like so many times. All right, someone asks, is bug-free required or preferred in big companies' interviews? Yeah, so I guess if you think of it from the perspective of the interviewer is likely asked their question many, many times. So in general, I think they have expectations that your code is generally bug-free. So it's good to, I think, yeah. Sorry, I'm like also trying to read the comments. But basically, I think you should kind of initially come up with a solution that covers most of the cases. I think edge cases are good to be aware of and go, if you can, like go back in and fix them. But at the end, like what happens is I think if you have time left over, they'll kind of generally try to get you to that bug-free solution. So if you like are able to code up the solution and there's around like 5-10 minutes left, they'll kind of keep pushing you to make sure that your code is in the best condition it can be. Like they'll actually ask you like, hey, like what would you do if this were like production code? How would you clean it up? How would you test this? So I think if you're able to get to a working solution, they'll kind of grill you harder and like kind of try to make sure that you get your code to like, hey, this is something I could ship out in the real world. Okay, so let's see. I'm just going to, all right, so someone asks if I have any advice on keeping calm. So in regards to keeping calm, I think, yeah, so it's challenging because I think interviews are really nerve-wracking. So I think actually what I found is pretty good advice is I think this process of doing a lot of mock interviews is actually really helpful. So when I was like an undergrad, what I did a lot of times was I would actually simulate a interview environment by having my friend ask me a question, by having like set up that time constraint and just really simulating what it would be like in a real world environment. So aside from that, I actually think sometimes I think pseudocoding is really helpful. So like I realized like looking through different sessions that people don't do this very often, but I think when you have like a solution in your mind and you don't kind of write it down and write your idea down and you're kind of jumping immediately to implementation, that can be really stressful because you're kind of trying to keep track of your kind of like plan, but also in addition to that, you're thinking, how do I write the best code with proper syntax? So I think having the pseudocode there is really helpful in regards to like keeping calm as I'm trying to implement. So aside from that, I'll say that I think when you go through like 1 or 2 real world interviews, I do think you kind of just get more comfortable with that process. And at the end of the day, like I think once you're already there in the interview, I mean, the best you can do is kind of just try and kind of give it your all. So yeah, that's kind of how I keep myself calm during interviews. I just tell myself, hey, like I've practiced a lot, I've studied a lot, like I'm just going to kind of give this my all. And yeah, so cool. So I'll just kind of answer a few more questions before I dive into more of like the actual instructions of how we'll do mock interviews themselves so that there's like ample time for you guys to kind of get through 2 sessions of it. So someone asked, do we have test cases for mock interviews? I typed up guides for each of the questions, so I'll kind of go through the instructions on those later. But what kind of happens in the real world is they'll kind of give you like example input output. They'll generally give you maybe like 1 or 2 cases of what example inputs and outputs will look like. And then you're actually kind of expected to come up with more test cases yourself. So with the mock interviews this time, I gave like, I think like 1 or 2 example inputs and outputs, and you're kind of just expected to kind of go through and try to come up with those test cases. Yeah, so cool. Is it more, someone asks, is it more important to have code that compiles or code that if you have more time would have been a more efficient solution? So that's actually generally something I'll ask the interviewer. So I think a lot of these questions you guys have are pretty good. So I think what generally I found is really great is, I mean, the interviewer is someone you can talk to and they're definitely open to answering questions. So sometimes if you think you have like a working solution, you should always ask them like, hey, like, should I jump into this code, or do you think I should spend more time trying to optimize this solution? So I think have an active conversation with your interviewer to kind of guide you to whether or not you should try to jump into code, or if they expect you to kind of try to find a better solution. So yeah, I think someone in the chat also had a good point. Basically, after you have a working solution, walk through it and try to find bugs and cover edge cases. Try to have that working solution first, and then go through and debug like additional, I think, trickier edge cases. And sometimes I'll even like let my interviewer know, hey, like I'm aware there's certain edge cases here. Like I'll add like a little comment in my code, like come back and like handle this edge case later. But for what I'm trying to do right now, I just kind of want to get a working solution. So that's also like, I think a good approach. If someone just tells me like, hey, I'm added this comment in my code, I'm going to come back and handle those like weird cases if I have time. But for now, I'm just going to try to tackle like the most of the cases. All right, so yeah, let me kind of jump back into the actual mock interviews themselves. So basically what will happen with the mock interviews is I'll break everyone out into groups of 2. And what that'll look like is, because I think neither people have really seen the question, what I've done is actually written like a guide for each of the questions you'll be asking. So I'll kind of give you guys 10 minutes to read through the interview question. That way you're kind of familiar with it as an interviewer. And then we'll have one mock interview round, which is one person asking the other person one question. We'll kind of wrap that up with a feedback session. So the interviewer will kind of give the interview some feedback, and then we'll do the reverse. So the instructions are located in the session 2 tab. So if you go to the session 2 tab right here, there's actually a mock interview guide, which is quite lengthy. Hopefully I saw that some of you guys were reading it, which is great. So if you see here, like, I'll kind of open up one of the questions. There's kind of a checklist I created for each interviewer. So what you want to do is, as the interviewer, you're just create that coder pad so that people can use it, read through the question, read through the solution, kind of walk through different example inputs and outputs to make sure you understand it. And I'll give you kind of like 5 to 10 minutes to do that. Unfortunately, I was only able to get all the solutions down in Python, but hopefully I had enough comments that you kind of get the general high-level overview of what is going on. And yeah, so there's that. So I think what we found is that some people are like proficient at one language and other people are proficient at others. Honestly, that also kind of happens in the real world setting. Like there have been interviewers who, so for me, like the language I prefer to code in is Python. And I've been in interviews where like my interviewer just doesn't really understand Python that well. Like they're not very comfortable with it. So yeah, we're kind of simulating that real world environment where like as you're coding along, you'll kind of just explain the syntax as you kind of code up your solution. So ideally that 40 minutes should give you enough time to pseudocode out your solution, implement it, and get that working. And it also gives you sufficient time to kind of explain your interviewer if they're kind of unfamiliar with syntax, what you're doing. So I think it's really great practice if you are interviewing with someone who isn't familiar with that language. I think it teaches you that skill of kind of walking through what you're doing and kind of explaining how that language works, because there are times where you might have an interviewer who just doesn't understand. And to that point, that's why I think, I know I like harp on this a lot, but pseudocoding is really important, because if you have an interviewer who might not be super comfortable with the language you picked, it kind of helps you to communicate as well and make sure you're on that same page. So yeah, so as the interviewer, here are just kind of some of the tips. So it might be some of your first times being like that interviewer. So try to ensure that the interviewee fully understands the question. So make sure that the interviewee kind of walks through a few test cases and make sure you're kind of on the same page, because these are quite complex questions and you just want to make sure that they are on the same page as you before moving forward. So likewise, like as the interviewee, make sure you're communicating to the interviewer like what you think the question is, and make sure there is kind of like agreement on what that question actually is. So I think also just be a good listener, like understand the interviewees like initial approach. If it's inefficient, maybe try to help hint them to maybe getting that more optimal solution. Try walking through their approach with them and try helping them identify the bottleneck and let them do the optimization. I think you also don't want to overstep your boundaries as an interviewer and like give them the solution. You kind of want to help guide them to the right solution. So make sure that they pseudocode and that they have a clear plan before going into coding. So you have around like 40 minutes to do like a medium style question. So there's more than enough time to kind of quickly jot down your idea. And pay close attention as they're coding. If they're kind of heading in a bad direction, or if you don't really understand what their code is doing, kind of be sure to prod them and ask them like what's happening there. So those are just some of the tips I have as an interviewer. I think there's actually a lot of value in this interviewer role. I think it gives you like good perspective on when you're in an interviewer, like when you're in an interview, what being an interviewer is like, and like what kind of how to communicate with an interviewer, because you've kind of done this role before as well. Sorry, so I kind of skipped through a lot. So for the interviewee, we've talked about umpire a lot, but try to apply the umpire method. It's super, super, super helpful. So fully understand that question, come up with their test cases, and definitely pseudocode before coding. Having a plan is just way easier. And I think it takes your mind off of like having to try to have the proper code syntax and trying to remember that plan. It'll help you out in the long run. And definitely trace through your code with example input and output as you're going through. And at the very end, I expect that you have kind of like a working solution and that you've created your own test cases. Cool. So at the very end, we'll kind of reserve a few minutes. So what's kind of happening there is, as the interviewer, try to give some feedback to the interviewee. What did that person do well? Like, what do you think they've done well? And like, what do you think they could improve on? Try to be like try to give constructive feedback. So maybe if you see any, like, if you have any tips on what they can improve on moving forward, that's really, really helpful. All right, so just a few last pointers. When a TA pops in the session, we expect that you are sharing your screen, so that way we can quickly jump in and see how far you're making it, and we can kind of help out if we see that you need help. We expect that there's like an ongoing conversation. In the past, I've jumped into rooms and it's been dead silent, and generally like I expect that there's a consistent conversation going on. And I also kind of will go into rooms and ask, like, if I don't see pseudocode, like why there isn't pseudocode in your code pad. I call it collab edit there, but yeah, I really do expect pseudocode there before implementation. So what I don't want to see is that both of you are looking at the solution during the interview before you even have a working solution. So I've seen that happen before. Definitely don't do that. I don't think it's very helpful at all. I think it's super helpful for you to simulate that real world environment and do the questions yourself. And the other don't thing is don't use LeetCode to test the code. So these questions we are pulling from LeetCode, and you shouldn't be relying on LeetCode to test your own code. We're really trying to build that skill of you like testing your own code, because that's what will happen in a real life situation. All right, so yeah, for the mock interview prep, we'll kind of ask you to read and understand the problem, try to come up with some example input output, think through the possible test cases and edge cases, read through the solution, make sure you understand the solution, create a new code pad and like save the URL, try to come up with some hints if you have time. And yeah, so I'll ask Elena to kind of break us out into sessions of 2. So basically, once we break you out into sessions of 2, if there are any problems, kind of jump back into the general pool. We'll try to sort things out. And one person will basically be kind of make sure you are clear on who's person A and person B. So make sure you two aren't looking at the same problem. And then we'll send out announcements throughout of like when you need to switch to the next problem and when you need to do the feedback. And we'll try to make it clear like when you need to make those transitions. All right. And then the last thing is if you are superstars and you end up with more time, I think what I recommend is just going through maybe like trying to tackle one of the assignment problems, like the post-session practice problems. If you end up with like more time because both of you guys were able to finish the question, maybe just pick a few questions here and try to like work through them yourselves. All right, so Elena, can you break out into the breakout rooms?
Sure, I'll open it now.
Thank you. Everyone. So awesome. So I kind of was able to jump into a few rooms. There are kind of some issues. So if there are ever any issues, feel free to give a shout out in that Slack group. I think the TAs and I have been pretty good at monitoring that. So we'll try to get anything sorted out. If you're kind of alone, if your partner cuts out, or like if they leave, we'll try to get that sorted out ASAP. And overall, I think it was really great. I like that every room I jumped into, there was like an active conversation happening. I saw that a lot of people had really great pseudocode. I actually posted a link of what like my pseudocode would look like, maybe for that brick wall question. So something pretty simple, but some kind of guidance of how you're going to do that question, I think is both helpful for you and the interviewer. So that was really awesome. I really enjoyed seeing that. Aside from that, I'd recommend if you weren't able to fully get through the questions to kind of just review those after and try to get some working code and try to kind of compile it and try to run it. So if there are any problems in the future, we'll be kind of doing this every week so that you'll kind of get more comfortable with this process. Overall, it was I really enjoyed kind of seeing all the conversations that was happening. And I think it actually simulates like a real world environment pretty well. So for next week, we're doing like a review session. So we kind of want you guys to have the opportunity to really get comfortable with this material before we move forward. So just a reminder, I kind of briefly touched on this. There are post-assessment questions. You have the hacker rank, and I think there'll be around like 20 to 25 minutes for like a Q&A next week for just general questions you might have for me. I'll try to answer them, whether they be about like interviewing, like resume, whatever you want to ask about. I'll reserve some like 20 minutes for next week to go through those questions. So I'll come out with I'll send it to the Slack group, but I'll come up with like a link that you guys can basically submit questions and over questions, and I'll just take the top questions from there. So if you have any feedback or any questions, feel free to Slack me or like Slack the group. We are generally pretty responsive, and I'll just stick around for the next like 5-10 minutes or so if anyone has any questions. Cool. Good job, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
No
you.
problem.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you a lot. Bye.
Bye. Okay, I'm looking at the chat group now. Oh, I guess I'm not really clear on what you mean by picking a random question to ask from LeetCode instead of a designated one. So you're trying to, so someone was trying to understand the solution. So was it that the solution was unclear as you were trying to read? Sorry, I'm trying to figure out what Isaiah is asking. Oh, I see. So, okay. I guess the idea was that it's really hard for us to designate who will get asked what. Like, basically the way Zoom group breaks out is it randomly splits people up in two, and we haven't actually figured out the best system to give people, like, to know which question to assign to people. So what we've come up with is basically we'll have the 10 minutes so that people can look at the solution and try to understand the solution. I'm not sure that's the best system right now, but yeah, that's what we're doing. I think in the future, we'll try to at least backfill them with Java solutions, or I'll try to get some Java solutions so you're not just looking at Python code, because I know some people are comfortable with other languages. And someone also asked, are there any programming languages preferred over others in interviews? No, I don't really think there's a preference for programming languages. I think just in general, do the language you're most comfortable with, because at the end of the day, that's probably the one you'll perform the fastest on. I know like Java and Python are quite popular, and then for front-end people, a lot of them will do like JavaScript. Yeah. Thanks everyone for coming. Oh, no worries. Yeah, I think for Isaiah, it's honestly kind of hard. So no worries. I think everyone understands that in 10 minutes, it is kind of hard to understand that solution. So I think for the most part, try to get through as much as you can. Oh, as for a resume review, yeah, definitely reach out to maybe like the TAs. Like we're generally really receptive, and we'll try to email you guys back with any resume feedback you might want. And then, yeah, Monika says, I found both questions to be quite tough. Anything that can help me solve? Honestly, they're both quite challenging problems. They're like medium questions, which I think fall in line with like the difficulty of questions you'll just generally see. So in regards to anything that can help you solve, I think for now, try to go through the solution. If you weren't able to get through it, try to go through it and try to implement it on your own. I do find that practice just makes things like a lot easier. So don't get too discouraged, and make sure you fully understand all the problems you go through, because we cover, I think, a lot of the techniques that ultimately will be helpful for you to use moving forward. So yeah, sorry, 1 second. Yeah, so someone asks, for interviewing purposes, do you recommend learning Python? I find that Python is easier. So I used to actually interview in Java, but it was also because I was super familiar with Java, and then I switched over to Python because I became more familiar with Python. I think if you wanted to switch over to Python now, you should do it soon. But if not, I think Java or whatever other language you're using is also fine. It's whatever you're most comfortable with. But I do find that I think Python is easier to code, but then it isn't typed. So you're kind of making a trade-off where it might be harder to debug Python as opposed to like a typed language like Java. So it depends on what you prefer. So someone asks, is it advisable to read up on the problems? Oh shoot, sorry. I'm trying to go through the order of everything. How applicable are interviewer or interview questions to the actual job of a software developer? Yeah, that's a good question. So unfortunately, sometimes like what is being asked in interview questions, like dynamic programming, is not something that I'm doing on my day-to-day. But unfortunately, companies will still ask these questions. So I think in general, they're really just trying to gauge, like, aside from being able to solve the question, they're also just trying to get a good gauge of like, how do you tackle a problem, and like, how does your code look? Are you able to debug your code? Like, those are also pretty good signals on like how you'll be in terms of like doing good industry work. Yeah, unfortunately, like the interview approach we take in software engineering isn't perfect because you're not doing like super complex algorithms in your day-to-day. But yeah, I think all this other stuff is pretty important. Someone asks, is it advisable to read up on the problems beforehand or just jump in them cold to simulate the interview experience? Yeah, so I think ideally what we want is in that 10-minute prep session, you're reading on the question you are getting interviewed for, and then you should kind of be jumping into it cold when you're getting interviewed. Yeah, the problems can be challenging to understand, but just be aware that these are problems that you will get in a real life setting. So this struggle of trying to understand the problem is honestly pretty realistic of what will happen in real life. And then, okay, so I need to head out in a few minutes, but I'll kind of answer this last question. Yeah, I think, so the idea is that it's going to be hard the first few times, right? Like, don't be too discouraged because it's never easy. Like, even as someone who has not done it for a while, like it would be challenging for me to jump back in again. It really does take like the first week or two or like 3 to kind of just adjust to that style of working because it's not something you're familiar with. So it's uncomfortable, but I think it's good to really practice the skill so that you're not uncomfortable when it comes to the interview. So someone asks, when I get stuck on a problem, I'm almost stuck for the whole time, but now I know how to feel better because after I analyze the problem, I could come up with a brute force and optimized solution. Cool, that's good. Do the questions in the code path portal cover a lot of techniques that we see in real interviews? Yeah, from last year's feedback, a lot of people were really happy with the coverage. Like the TAs have taken a lot of time to comb through all the questions and try to find a good subset of questions that will cover a lot of techniques. So there are like thousands of questions out there and some might be super niche, but for the most part, I think we're teaching you strategies that will apply to most questions. Yeah. Yeah, I think Yash took it last year and he liked it. What is the point of asking whether input fits into memory? I haven't gotten asked that actually. So I think sometimes you might get an interviewer that's really trying to grill you on super intense system stuff. I haven't really encountered that, especially not as like a new grad or like in someone going into like an intern interview setting. Yeah, that hasn't happened from my experience. Okay, cool. Well, I think you guys will get better as time goes on. We have like 10 more weeks of problems. So I think it's definitely something you'll just get really comfortable with. We're exposing you to a lot of questions. So yeah, they're meant to be challenging, but you guys will be okay. All right, I'll see you next week. I'm also teaching next week, but good job, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.